Good morning. We're very pleased that you are joining us today at this event organized by the World Bank as part of the 16 Days of Activism against Gender-Based Violence. In its commitments to women's rights to a life free of violence and gender equality, the World Bank works with governments providing technical assistance and financial resources to address gender-based violence from different sectors. These include, for instance, water, basic sanitation, energy, transportation, digital development, urban development, education, health, social protection, environment, and many others. The prevention of GBV and the improvement of services for survivors are fundamental issues for the World Bank in the LEC region. My name is Jacobus. I'm a senior economist, and I have the privilege of leading the Gender Innovation Lab for LEC. I will be moderating today's event, where you, the audience, can learn about governments and how they try to address gender-based violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how the collaboration between policymakers and organizations in the region is essential to develop innovative solutions to prevent and mitigate gender-based violence in the region. I would like to remind you that this event is being broadcast on social media, on the World Bank Twitter in English, at World Bank Caribbean, WB Caribbean, and in Spanish on Banco Mundial LAC. You can also watch it on the bank's YouTube channel, Banco Mundial en América Latina, where you can send us your questions and comments also, and we'll try to address some of them towards the end of this event. We're going to start the event with Bill Maloney. He is our chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean, and he's going to provide the opening remarks for this event. Next, we will hear presentations from our excellent panel, formed by Diana Arango, our global lead on gender-based violence for the gender group at the World Bank, María Noel Valeza, regional director for the Americas and the Caribbean of UN Women, and Mariana Elefante, private sector development specialist at the World Bank for the Women, Business, and the Law Project. And she will share with us the latest legal gaps to address GBV in the region and the actions that can be taken to overcome. So with this, Bill, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. Good morning to everyone. Muy buenos días a todos. I want to thank the Latin American and Caribbean Gender Innovation Lab and the Social Sustainability and Inclusion team for organizing this event, and to all of you who are participating. Gracias por abrirnos ese espacio. It struck me originally that it might be a bit odd that it be the chief economist opening this instead of maybe the vice president, for example. But as I thought about it, I thought that actually is entirely appropriate and necessary, just because knowledge around the prevalence of gender-based violence, its causes, its likely solutions, is the most powerful tool that we have to progress on this issue. And I think the first piece I read on this topic was probably Andy Morris and Ellsberg and Bott's article 15 years ago that basically just noted how little analytical work we had on the issue of gender-based violence in the developing world, and that most of what we were relying on was knowledge from the advanced countries. We've made a lot of progress on that front, and this kind of initiative exactly helps advance that cause. Now, why does this matter? Well, as we know, what's measured is managed, or at least what's measured gets attention. And while measurement remains really challenging to this issue, we know some very cold, stylized facts. We know that more than a third of women in the region have reported having experienced physical or sexual violence by a current or a former partner, or sexual violence committed by someone who is not their partner. That is a very large number. The problem of femicide in the region is large. LAC has 14 of the 25 countries with the highest levels of femicide in the world. That is a very depressingly high number for our region. If part of what economic development is reducing the uncertainty that people feel, increasing their autonomy and their agency to lead fulfilling lives, then this is a critical dimension of our development agenda. The knowledge agenda is also key because we need to understand better both the consequences and the causes. Consequences are becoming clearer in many dimensions. Clearly, the most central and important are the psychic costs to the victims. I expect most of us know somebody directly or indirectly who are precisely bearing those costs and know how profound they are and how persistent they are. And that is probably the moral ground on which this discussion should happen. On the other hand, research has shown that there are high costs to the health systems and to counseling systems and related services, the justice system, the child and welfare support system. All these systems are affected by this high rate of gender-based violence incidents. Recent work also, Professor Varahorna and others suggests that the losses in human capital just from women, for instance, missing work can be very large, and the numbers are like 1.6 to 6.4% of GDP lost. Those are also large numbers. I don't know if these statistics on lost productivity or cost of the health system are more persuasive to policymakers than just the clear ethical and equity issue, but the knowledge helps make the case on several fronts, and that's important. To reduce gender-based violence, we need to understand the causes, and we're understanding that more and more. We know that weaker discriminatory legal and institutional frameworks, persistent anti-women social norms are part of this problem. And in some sense, changing legal institutions or changing laws is the easier part. Changing norms is harder. And then if you get down to where does this violence come from in the first place, and you look at some of the studies on the intergenerational transmission of violence, the whole issue becomes more and more complex. We know from the images study that in 6 countries studied, one of which I think at least Brazil was in there, maybe Chile, the association between witnessing or experiencing violence during childhood and perpetrating intimate partner violence as an adult was statistically significant and important. We know that the CARE study reported that in Sri Lanka, for instance, men who experienced childhood violence were 1.7 to 2 times more likely to be violent against their intimate partners than men who did not experience abuse. So it is a question of changing norms and of changing legal and institutional frameworks. But the whole issue is part of a much larger and, if you will, darker issue of household and societal violence that is hard to know how to approach and to really make progress on. But we are. Some of the work that the Gender Lab here is doing, for instance, the work by Perova and Reynolds, are documenting interventions that actually have very large impacts. For instance, establishing a women's police station in a metropolitan area in Brazil is associated with a reduction in female homicide rates by 17%. 17% is a large number, and it's great that we have confidently and statistically carefully documented the impact of one of the tools we have. We need to do more of this. We need more studies showing what really works and what doesn't work. And that's what this conference is about. And I wish you all luck in making more progress on this issue. Thanks very much.
Dear Bill, thank you for your opening words. I would now like to give the floor to Diana Arango. She's our global lead on gender-based violence, and she will explain what the World Bank is doing in the region on issues of public policy on gender-based violence. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Oh, thank you. Hi, can you hear me? Am I on the screen now? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Oh, great. I can't see myself on the screen. Okay, now I can see myself. Thank you so much, Jacob, for inviting me to talk. about this issue. And as the global lead, I'm going to share with you kind of what the whole World Bank is doing. And I can actually talk about this issue for days, so please help me keep on time. It's right now is a really good time to talk about what the World Bank has done, because the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Group and the Gender Group have just finished a review of the last decade of work that the World Bank has done on gender-based violence. Sorry. And so in this review, we found that in 2013, Alice Willman and Crystal Corman did this review of what the World Bank had done until 2013. And they found 38 projects that the World Bank had invested in gender-based violence. And so, as Bill mentioned before, we had been working on understanding gender-based violence since 2015 with that Morrison-Bott Orlando document that he referenced. So the World Bank had already kind of understood that gender-based violence was a development challenge, an issue to be addressed, is an integral part of gender inequality. And so we started investing slowly in operations to address gender-based violence and to promote prevention and response to the issue and eliminate all forms of violence. In 2013, Alice and Crystal found 38 operations, as I mentioned, and the investment amounted to $22.5 million across those 38 interventions. And those didn't cover all regions, really mainly Africa and Latin America had invested in the portfolio. 10 years later, with this GBV retrospective that SSI's Patricia Fernandez and I am leading with an amazing team, we're seeing that there are now 390 operations across the bank that have components addressing gender-based violence in every region and in every sector. We're not able to calculate the total investment because some are activities embedded within larger projects, but we were able to calculate 4% of the investment. And that 4% of the investment of the 390 operations totals over $680 million. So what the World Bank is doing on gender-based violence is increasing its recognition that it's a development issue, really working on it throughout all sectoral entry points that it can, and really cementing this as part of the agenda for gender equality, for achieving gender equality. And so today I want to also talk about a specific instrument that the World Bank has to address, to help address gender-based violence, and that's development policy financing. So there were some development policy loans in that 2013 study that was done by Alice and Crystal. There were a handful. Now we have 44 DPLs that really support us in enabling legislation and legal reform to address multiple forms of gender-based violence women and girls experience globally. Recent DPOs really focus in on 3 types of gender-based violence. And when I say that the World Bank works on gender-based violence, I'm talking about that umbrella term of all forms of violence experienced by women and girls just based on their gender identity or gender expression. And so the DPOs, the development policy operations that help with the legislation reform, with providing enabling legislation, are focusing on intimate partner violence, on child marriage, and on sexual harassment, both at the workplace and in public spaces such as transport. And so I want to give you some examples of what those development policy operations look like and what they're doing. So for example, a DPO in Uruguay supported a decree that called for the strengthening of the health sector response to survivors of GBV, which enabled the Ministry of Public Health to access financing to establish protocols for healthcare professionals and roll out training on the attention and rehabilitation of survivors. There was another DPO that had a prior action. This is how DPOs are formulated, that was implemented by the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Colombia. And this DPO supported the adoption of a certification process where the Ministry of Mines and Energy included the adoption of a zero tolerance policy for gender-based violence. And they also established a goal to increase the share of women in decision-making positions and preferential scoring for systems to support women-owned businesses in procurement processes. We also have DPOs in Mexico, India, and Haiti that support an increase in women's asset ownership or access to cash transfers to decrease economic tensions, leading to increases in IPV, to enable women to become financially independent and potentially leave violent relationships. So as you can see, Jacob, there's a lot of different entry points on DPOs that could help fill in regulatory gaps or strengthen regulation that already exists and create an enabling environment for the work to eliminate violence against women at the country level. What we've seen is most effective is when these development policy operations are followed up by operations that help with the implementation of the law. And these are more investment policy financing type operations. So the coupling of these two unique instruments that the bank has really can allow us to work on the issue of eliminating violence against women at scale, at a national level, strengthening systems. What we see the bank doing in those 390 operations that I mentioned before is really kind of playing to its strategic advantages, right? The scale that it can work on. So we're seeing investments in system strengthening, for example, the health sector system strengthening, or education system strengthening, where we're building safe education establishments for women and girls, boys and girls. We're seeing strengthening of transport corridors, where now there is design that takes into account the risks that women face in using public transportation. And for that, we have one of the first DPLs in Latin America was in Rio, in the Rio metro system, where it had a phased approach across 3 different DPLs to add in normative framework around sexual harassment in public spaces, response services for sexual harassment in public spaces, training for public transportation operators on how to respond to women disclosing violence to them. So really an instrument that can be flexible. The third thing that we do at the bank that is unique is that we in FCV settings can enter in to provide a multi-sectoral response. And we're seeing that in places that have conflict affected populations. We're seeing that in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh, but we also hope to work in the region, for example, in Colombia, and strengthen the response to violence that are faced by, for example, refugee or migrant. What's the politically correct term for Venezuelan migrants, I would say, that live in Colombia, Peru, and the region. So that's kind of a short explanation of all the things that the World Bank is doing. I just really want to emphasize we're working across all sectors and every region, but Latin America is definitely innovating in the use of several instruments and in the addressing different types of violence that women experience on a daily basis.
Diana, thank you so much for your contribution, and it's encouraging to hear you talk about the expansion of our work on this theme. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question. In your discussion, you focused very much on the operational work of the World Bank, but of course, we're also quite heavily engaged in analytics, research, and measurements. I wanted to ask you if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. So that is true. I just spoke of kind of our operations where we're working with our client governments to help them allocate finances to supporting the elimination of violence against women and girls. But the World Bank does much more than that. We do strong analytic pieces to help clients understand the prevalence and the impact of violence against women and girls in their communities. Studies. We didn't do the VARA study that Bill mentioned before, but we do use data on the economic impact. IFC does a lot of work on the cost to businesses of intimate partner violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. And you know, we understand that leads to high levels of absenteeism and low productivity. And then we have the Gender Innovation Labs, like the Latin America Gender Innovation Lab, that has done some really innovative work on measurement. And measurement work is needed because of the pandemic, like COVID, that didn't allow us to have enumerators in the field accessing women to ask them about their experience of violence. So we used rapid phone surveys. I say I'm part of your Gender Innovation Lab, Jacob. I'm taking the credit for your work. But the Innovation Lab did rapid phone surveys. The Gender Innovation Lab has also supported studies on which forms of reporting and disclosing violence are better for getting accurate prevalence estimates on the actual prevalence of violence in communities. And so we've innovated with face-to-face surveys, with computer automated surveys, with also kind of surveys that are left in boxes where women don't have to interact with anyone or any computer. So there's a lot of innovation being done by the Gender Innovation Labs. And we're also starting to see an increase in them measuring the impact of both World Bank finance operations that have specific outcomes to reduce gender-based violence, but also kind of our bread and butter operations like cash transfers to see what kind of impacts those might have in addressing gender-based violence. So the World Bank is really, like I said before, has cemented its commitment to addressing gender-based violence as part of a development challenge, as part of gender inequality, and really happy to see this agenda grow and the commitment from the Latin America region to this area.
Thank you so much, Diana. We're now going to hear from Ms. María Noel Valeza, Regional Director for the Americas and the Caribbean at UN Women. She's going to talk about the main challenges in the region in terms of the formulation and implementation of public policies for the elimination of gender-based violence. María, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Muchísimas gracias. Muy buenos días a todos y todas.
Thank you so much. Welcome. It's a pleasure for UN Women to be here with the World Bank today as part of these 16 days of activism that started, as you know, on November 25th, the International Day of Violence Against Women, and will finish on December 10th, that is Human Rights Day. So along these 16 days, we are actively talking about the subject of eliminating gender-based violence. I'm so pleased to have heard Diana. I loved listening to you, how the bank has evolved on the issue of violence. It's amazing that growth, not only in the modules, in the services, and also in the loans and the new amounts, and also hearing William Malone, because it is an economic issue, but it is mainly a human rights issue. It's an issue of the lack of freedom that we women have, and they cannot reach that freedom because of that violence that they experience throughout their lives, because it starts when they are young girls and it finishes when they are old ladies. Unfortunately, violence is a continuum that women have to face in public spaces, public transportation, at work harassment. That's why it's so important to have a comprehensive legislation against violence, not just talk about violence, domestic violence, or family violence. For me, Jacob, it's also a pleasure to be with you today. And I know that the Innovation Lab is very active. And in some countries, we are working together actually to conduct some actions. We consider at UN Women, and we are committed to strengthening comprehensive actions, because there has to be prevention, protection, care, research, also prosecution, because we need a due process and sanctions, of course, and a repair for the victims in order to guarantee the rights of every woman, girl, and adolescent to a violence-free life. And one of the big aspects of violence is the frustration that women feel, that lack of freedom not being able to move around freely in society. And of course, we shouldn't forget a very important aspect that has very serious economic consequences, and that is mental health. The mental health of a woman that is exposed to violence, economic, physical violence, that truly leads her to that frustration, and she's not then an economic active individual in society, and she cannot participate in that society with empowerment. So this is something I wanted to mention. Now, our vision, of course, is to eradicate violence, but unfortunately, we are not there yet. We have 12 women per day that die just because they're women. Yesterday, there was a femicide in Panama, 3 in Uruguay, 4 in Mexico, and that's the case every day. There's no single day where we don't have 12 or 13 women that die just because they're women. We have made progress, though. We have 13 countries that have comprehensive violence laws, because it's important to talk about violence in a comprehensive manner, not just family violence. There are 17 countries that have classified femicide as a crime, and there are countries that have rules for data collection. From the UN, we are making a huge effort through the Observatory of Violence that we have at ECLAC, precisely to have data, because without data, it's difficult to make public policies and to call attention. That's why we are making development in regulatory frameworks, data, putting this issue of prevention on the table so that society understands that it's also an economic issue, but basically it's a human rights issue. The most recent statistics about the prevalence of gender-based violence in the region show that the regulatory progress is not enough, as Jacob mentioned at the beginning. Violence survivors and their family members find different barriers in the access to justice, for instance. The lack of legal practices that can ensure women that they will not be re-victimized, they will not be discriminated against again. All judicial actors having no gender lens. That's why it's so important to have a specialized justice for women that suffer violence, specialized law enforcement, specialized prosecutors. That's why we think this is essential. And also the integration of public services that deal with survivors. Otherwise, the women is re-victimized in each process, and having all in the same place, because otherwise it's very difficult for women, because besides lacking resources and being absolutely dependent in many cases of the perpetrators, they cannot even file a complaint. So if you analyze the 4,200 women that die per year, only 5% reported that violence before. That means that women do not report enough, and mainly femicide victims. It's also important for us to generate specialized networks, gender networks. So we are working with the Ibero-American Association of Prosecutors, because they have that ability to generate data and preserve the evidence, because often when women need a due process to protect her, and when they have some precautionary measures, it's important to preserve the evidence in the investigation of violence cases. But we think that for public policies to be effective, we need to achieve a cultural change, as William was mentioning. And that cultural change, that change in the social norms, that change in behavior, it's the most difficult thing to do. But we all have to work to achieve it. So UN Women is working with the gender violence team to create, use, disseminate innovative policies that support this behavioral change through behavioral sciences. We conducted a study that identified possible behaviors and barriers, proposing informed solutions based on behavioral science to involve men in the prevention of violence against women in the region. Based on key lessons, we designed and developed model campaigns intended to involve witnesses and bystanders in the prevention of violence against women. We also work on the legal gaps with MISETNI, that is the institution created by Belén do Pará, the first Inter-American Convention on Violence. And there we work to identify the barriers, the loopholes, those failures. So we are working on it. We're working on in the access to justice, which is also important, but working on prevention, economic empowerment for women. And as we said in the Women's Conference that was held very recently in Buenos Aires, the regional conference on women, that's the only region in the world actually that has a regional conference on women. That was the 15th held in Buenos Aires. There we said that the issue of care is essential as well. That's why we have to speak of comprehensive care systems to support women as active economic actors. So that's enough for me, Jacob. If you want more details or if you want more questions, of course, I will be available. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your contribution, María Noel. It's great to hear you speak. I do have a follow-up question. You mentioned the shocking numbers of women who die from femicide every day. And of course, we would like the event today to serve also as a call for action. So perhaps you want to say something about the solutions that we pursue to bring these numbers down finally.
Bueno, como soluciones.
Of course. Well, as solutions, I think we have to work on 4 areas. The first one is prevention, as I said. Prevention is essential. And I'd like to hear Diana, when we do the scale up of the operations at the bank or the operations in countries in the area of education, we do not modify enough educational systems in order to transmit this topic even from kindergarten years, because all those kids also observe and witness violence. And as William was saying, there are studies that clearly show that a young boy that observed violence at home can become violent in the future. So we have to invest much more on education. Then the same in healthcare. The same for statistics and data. The data is very scattered in Latin America. That's why we have to make an effort, as we are doing in almost all the countries, to unify the number of femicides. And of course, we have to make a huge effort on reporting. And for women to report, we need that interagency approach so that it's at the service of women, public services, so that women can go, no matter their social status, but so that they can go to a single window where they can then present their claims. But of course, we need women to join the labor market. In our region, we have 50% women and only 47% are in the labor market. Why is that? Because they don't have who to leave their kids with. There are no integrated care systems. And as long as that is the case, that is also part of the prevention system for violence. I don't know if I have answered your question. And just a final comment I would like to make. There's a lack of political will. We have male presidents in the region, only 3 female presidents in Trinidad, Barbados. I never hear male presidents speak about this as if it were an emergency issue. It is a social emergency issue. It's a pandemic in the shadow, and there's no vaccine against it. So we need to have this political will. Another thing is we need budgets for this. The budgets for the ministries of gender are very poor. And for violence, there's even fewer funds. So we all together need to push for much more investment in infrastructure, for instance. There's no infrastructure, so we need that. That's why it's so important for the World Bank to be another voice asking for that. And of course, I hope there are more loans in the region for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this call to action, and we definitely take it to heart. With that, I would like to introduce our last panelist, Mariana Elefante. She's going to talk about World Bank findings on the legal gaps that exist in addressing gender-based violence in the region, and some of the main challenges and recommendations. Welcome, Marina.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this kind invitation. It is truly a pleasure for me to be here with you this morning to present the work that we are doing on violence against women at the World Bank's Women, Business and the Law project. Just to give you a bit of background, Women, Business and the Law publishes an annual report and an index that measures laws and regulations affecting women's employment and entrepreneurship in 190 economies. And since 2014, we have been collecting data on legal frameworks addressing two aspects of gender-based violence against women: domestic violence and sexual harassment in employment. And for us, at Women, Business and the Law, it is important to measure the existence of such laws because addressing violence against women is not only a human rights imperative, but it also makes economic sense. Violence against women has significant implications in terms of lower productivity, decreased company profitability, and increased labor costs. So today, I would like to share with you some of our findings in the Latin America and Caribbean region in the two areas that we measure: domestic violence and sexual harassment in employment. So globally, there are 30 economies worldwide where no domestic violence legislation or provision has been enacted. But in Latin America and Caribbean, all economies, except for one, with the exception of Haiti, have adopted legislation protecting women from domestic violence. We also keep track not just of countries that are adopting new laws, but also those that are improving their legal existing measures against violence against women. For example, in May 2021, Costa Rica enacted a new law on violence against women, which now criminalizes domestic violence, not just in marriage, but also in a wider range of relationships after divorce or a breakup, or even if both parties were just living together or dating, thus complementing the existing provisions in the Code of Criminal Procedure. Similarly, in Honduras, in addition to their domestic violence law, they have reformed their criminal code in 2019 to expand the criminalization of physical and psychological abuse inflicted upon spouses. And while we know that all but one of the 31 economies in the region protect women against domestic violence, and also provide a procedure to obtain a protection order against the perpetrators, only 23 of these economies legally protect women from all four forms of domestic violence, that is, physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. And only 26 of these economies ensure that domestic violence is criminalized. When it comes to sexual harassment in employment, globally, 46 economies lack specific legislation, and 10 out of these 46 economies still showing legal gaps in this area are in the Latin America and Caribbean region, predominantly in the Caribbean. However, we're also capturing some reforms in this area. For example, in 2020, Barbados adopted a Sexual Harassment in Prevention Act, which also provides for civil remedies for the victims. What is notable about this law is the fact that it creates a completely separate procedure to seek justice. And so it speeds up the process and it avoids the hurdles of the regular justice process. And in 2022, Jamaica enacted a Sexual Harassment Act, which also provides for civil remedies for survivors. Now, among the 22 economies in Latin America that have legislation on sexual harassment in employment, Argentina is the only one that does not provide criminal penalties or civil remedies for the survivors. And while currently half of the 22 economies addressing sexual harassment in employment do it through the criminal code, about half of those address this issue through the labor code only. What does that mean? It means that it doesn't provide special procedures, and these claims are equal to any other labor claim. Women, Business, and the Law has also embarked in the exercise of tracking progress toward gender legal equality, that is equality in the law, over the last 5 decades. And over the past 53 years, the number of economies introducing laws addressing domestic violence and sexual harassment in employment has risen dramatically from 0. And by looking at this data, we can observe a spike in the 90s, in that particular decade. And this is interesting because it corresponds to the adoption in 1994 of the Convention of Belém do Pará, the first regional legally binding international treaty that criminalizes all forms of violence against women. And it is important to be aware of these trends to understand what the main drivers of reform are and stress the importance of international law as a catalyst for reform. So to conclude, some of the gaps that we find are not just in terms of whether a law exists or not, but ideally, we want these laws to be effective and to that end to be well drafted and comprehensive. So just to give you a few recommendations, it is important that domestic violence legislation recognizes all 4 forms of violence, that is physical, sexual, psychological, and economic, and provides special procedures to obtain protection orders and file complaints, along with criminal penalties for violation of those protection orders. And special procedures means prohibiting mediation, guaranteeing confidentiality, and avoiding those defenses that cause re-victimization. And finally, also ensuring that the law mandates the provision of services for survivors, such as health and psychological support, legal aid, and livelihood support. And similarly, a good sexual harassment in employment law should provide for a clear and detailed definition of sexual harassment with examples of the criminalized behaviors. It should criminalize the behavior that is making criminal penalties available for the perpetrator and civil remedies for the survivors, and set obligations for employers, such as the adoption of protocols and codes of conduct and special procedures to report these behaviors. And finally, and more broadly, laws should mandate that national budget is allocated for a meaningful implementation of these laws. And also, given the demonstrated driving power of regional conventions, governments should be encouraged to really come together and agree on new regional standards on this topic. And with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for your contribution, Marina. By now, Women, Business, and the Law is a well-established instrument, but I would like to ask you if there are any plans for next steps, maybe to develop the index, any new indicators that could potentially be included.
Indeed, yes. In fact, in order to have a better understanding of the current status of violence against women legislation and also how such laws are applied in practice, we are piloting the collection and analysis of additional measures of legal protection in new areas, including child marriage, marital rape, female genital mutilations, and sexual harassment in education, public places, and cyber harassment. And we're not just collecting data on de jure frameworks, but also on process frameworks, on the existence of policy instruments that are meant to support the implementation of such laws. For example, the actual provision of services to victims, access to justice measures, national plans, budgetary commitments, and monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. So we are planning to present the findings of this pilot exercise in the 2024 edition of the Women, Business and the Law report, and to develop a new and more comprehensive safety indicator that will be added to the index in the 2025 edition of our report. So we are hoping this way to provide more and comprehensive data and analysis to really inform the design of effective laws and policies to address gender-based violence against women. And with that, I would like to invite you to visit our website at wbl.worldbank.org, where you can read our report and download our data, where you can see where these legal gaps are and also view some examples of legal measures that work. So we are hoping that together we will be able to address more effectively this very important issue. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marina. The audience has been sending us some of their questions, and we would like to take a little more time to answer a few of them during this broadcast. We will try to answer the rest of them through our Twitter and YouTube channels. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask the panelists to be concise in their responses. Diana, I'm going to ask the first question to you, if that's okay. We got a question on working on marginalized territories and including local leaders in our policies and programs. Can you reflect on that? How can we do a good job in terms of including them?
Sure. I mean, I think we can do a great job. And there's an example that I don't lead, it's led out of the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Group in Latin America that's working actually with indigenous populations in Ecuador. And it's been a very participatory process from the outset of even coming up with the design and how the community should be engaged in the issue of prevention and response to gender-based violence. Who are the key stakeholders? What are the key issues? What are the norms that should be addressed? What are the other additional components like economic empowerment that should be part of the intervention? And I think the team has done an excellent job of really keeping consultations and communications with recognized indigenous women leadership groups as part of the design of this operation. And so I think this is just an example of how to do this work well, right? There are women's movements on the ground that are there that have been working on the issues of equality and living a life free of violence. And there are those women's groups that represent indigenous women, LGBTIQ populations, other Afro-descendant populations in the region that are quite active and quite strong. As María Noel said, the region has had 15 years of working together on improving the rights of women and girls. So it's not like there's not a wealth of resources on the ground that we should be working alongside with to do this work.
Thank you so much for your response. The next question, if I may, will be for María Noel. The question is on the topic of positive masculinities and how can that be integrated in our responses to make sure that we educate men?
That's a big question. Well, I think, first of all, as I said, education. I think education is critical from primary, but I think that using behavioral science, using a positive deviance, we have to find those positive men that, I mean, all men are of good will and positive. We have to find those who can help us to really move forward the activism and the change. And for that, I do believe in the new masculinities that are emerging. We have to shape them to be more Latin American. We are doing a lot of campaigns in very machistas countries like Mexico. And it's amazing when those men really understand what they are doing because they don't realize what they are doing. When they understand, there is a behavioral change. So we have to be doing much more than that, engaging with advertising agencies, with the press, with the social media. I think we have the luxury to have this access to those platforms. So we have to work there. But don't forget that there are many men that don't have access to social media and they are extremely violent. And that I can say in the indigenous communities, the violence is intrinsic, is structural. So we have to tackle the structural violence and see where we can make a change and just do it. I mean, and the good thing is that with having these kind of activities where we are all in the same boat, I think we are sending a signal as well that we are all trying to eliminate the violence.
Thank you, María Noel. I fully agree with your response. We're going to move on to the third question, which is for Marina. Marina, you talked about different types of violence, and the question is, how can we promote laws that address all different kinds of violence and are not limited to physical or sexual violence?
Yes, indeed. It is the first and most intuitive way of addressing violence against women is to think about acts of physical violence or to think about acts of sexual violence. But at the same time, there are different forms of abuse against women, and especially in a spousal relationship, one way is to withdraw access to resources, or, for example, a husband limiting a wife's capacity to work. This is something that we measure and we address at Women, Business and the Law. And then for that reason, because it really affects women's agency and women's economic opportunity, it is important to address different forms of economic violence. For example, property damage, restricting access to financial resources, access to education or the labor market, and not complying with economic responsibilities such as alimony. And so all of these aspects are crucial in protecting women and making sure that they are really safe from all forms of violence.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marina, for your response. Thank you to all of the panelists for the engaging discussion, to Bill for the opening remarks, and to the audience for joining us today in this exchange of ideas and solutions. We hope that this virtual event has contributed to addressing gender-based violence in the region, and that we can all contribute to saving lives and protecting the physical and mental well-being of women and girls. You can learn more about the work of the World Bank, the Social Inclusion Team, the Gender Innovation Lab online. There are many resources. Thank you so much to all for joining, and we hope we will see you again soon.